Welcome, everyone, to the Cybersecurity Podcast. It's the Cybersecurity Podcast with a little extra BS. I'm Andrew Nuxel.
And I'm Nathaniel Dick.
And today we are joined by Joe Anderson. Joe and I were colleagues in previous roles and have worked together for many years. Went our separate ways, but keep in contact. And now Joe is working for an organization called TechSolve. Joe, I'll let you introduce yourself and give a little insight into what you do.
Thank you. No, I appreciate the opportunity. So I want to thank you both for inviting me to come on and talk about some things that are near and dear to me, and one of which is myself and kind of how I got here. So the way I got into cybersecurity was through IT. Spent probably 25, 26 years, pivoted into cybersecurity. It's where I met you. And now I work for a company called TechSolve, where I work in a department that helps small to mid-sized manufacturers achieve CMMC compliance and work through that. It's a long process, and we oftentimes say that we're in it for the long haul. I get to do risk identification. Part of that's through vulnerability scanning and penetration testing, and I'm really excited to be able to talk a little bit about this today.
Great. Good to have you here. So our main focus today is going to be around compliance, and in particular, CMMC. So we'll get to that, but as everyone probably knows, there was a pretty big incident late last week, still rolling into this week. And so let's just dive right into that. As everyone probably knows by this point, CrowdStrike released an update, signature file in some regards, but an update to their platform that rendered pretty much any Windows operating system inoperable, the lovely blue screen of death, and caused chaos. Again, many organizations still recovering of it. So this is going to obviously roll into compliance, but a couple observations that I had. I think they've already stated there'll obviously be a congressional hearing about this. CrowdStrike's CEO and others are going to be on the hot seat. They're going to be brought in. That's just a foregone conclusion that they're going to get grilled about this. But as we're talking about compliance and that being the spirit of our topic today, can't help but wonder, how does an organization, one of two things happen. Either there was a malicious actor within that organization that is exploiting something that they knew could be done. It's not a brand new threat vector. Insider threat has always been a threat vector, but it's something new that don't think is as heavily thought about as it should be, and this will definitely shine a light on it. Either someone did this intentionally, or absolutely zero testing took place on the patch that was rolled out. I can understand, believe that this was tested in an accident if they came back and said, Windows 10, Service Pack 2, version 12345, any device running that was impacted. This was almost every Windows device that had the file applied to it. So obviously, someone intentionally did this, or no rigor around.
How could you miss this in testing?
Okay,
Did you even turn it on? Or did they try it on Linux or something? It's very hard to imagine how that could have happened. So first guess is they must have not tested, or they had some simulated environment that took out, basically we're in safe mode or something that took out a real simulated Windows environment or something.
Even in an immature organization, though, testing takes place on patches. Most organizations do not roll all of their packages out to production, let alone to customers, prior to testing them in some regard. And it's pretty clear that if they had tried this on any Windows environment, they would have seen the negative results. And they applied it, and as soon as it took hold, their systems crashed.
I agree. I think there were multiple failures, and I'll be first to say every company can make mistakes, but the magnitude and the level of the mistakes, I mean, this was a cascading failure of monumental proportions. So in addition to the testing, I would even question, what is the rollout strategy? Given the footprint that they have. And that's the other thing that was very interesting is I know CrowdStrike's a very popular product. And they have a huge presence. but to see some of the numbers come out, like this is where this stuff's deployed. And for that to not roll out in smaller chunks is it's just amazing to me. And one of the things I saw on LinkedIn, what was funny was you never roll things out into production on a Friday, right? There are times where it makes more sense to kind of roll something out like this. So those are some of the things that I was just like, what's going on?
Yeah. So there were a lot of checks and balances that could have been implemented that may have, at a minimum, slowed this down, minimized impact, et cetera, but they clearly weren't followed or implemented properly.
Well, and I think a lot of people are pointing to, well, you're reliant on a vendor like Microsoft, if you're all Microsoft, why you're stuck with an error. Well, it's really not Microsoft's issue. This was agnostic of that. It was more just releasing a bad update. If
I'm
more
glad you brought that up.
Mac OS, it would have been an issue on Mac OS. I think that's the wrong finger to point at this time. It's more on the CrowdStrike, at least is what we know now. And you're
There-
right, too, like organizations make mistakes. Maybe that's what happened, but it just seems way too much to be impact.
I can't help but think that somebody did this intentionally. I can't help but think that. I don't think, I've been in multiple organizations where either partners have worked with CrowdStrike or my organization's worked with CrowdStrike. I have a lot of respect for them. Not the type of situation, that I would say, oh, definitely don't do business with CrowdStrike again. I'd like to hear the full story, but I can't help but think that this was somebody intentionally did this. That's just my thought.
Well, when will they blame the intern?
Or DNS.
There's got to be a
Yeah.
kind of
The DNS could be very
Nathaniel, you mentioned Microsoft, and it was funny because, early Friday morning, woke up, turned the news on. I could tell by the look on the reporter's face. At first, I thought, oh no, there's been a terrorist attack.
Yeah.
Something bad. And I'm kind of like, okay, what the heck's going on? They're showing the airport, and the Charlotte airport has been under construction for at least the past 3 years. And then they go back and they say, Microsoft has had an outage worldwide.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, Microsoft, that's bad. I started thinking about it. But less than 30 seconds later, I've already ascertained this wasn't Microsoft that caused this. It was a vendor that caused CrowdStrike's issue. But I found so much glee in the fact that Microsoft was blamed for somebody else's problem, because I can't tell you how many times, and Jerry, you and I were on a couple of these calls together where I was like beating my head against the wall and threatening to cancel contracts with Microsoft, where they had told you point blank, this is not a Microsoft problem, this is a vendor problem. And they send you chasing your tail. And even when you come back and you're like, dude, it 100% was your fault all along. And I had to have a vendor fix your problem for you. And they're always like, my bad. I mean, come on. I don't want anybody to get in trouble for somebody else's mistake, but it's kind of poetic justice. That's karma for your aching.
Well, and there's been a lot of struggles with their patching as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they've got some challenges too. And I think these kinds of problems are going to continue to manifest, right? We're a global economy. We need all of these different systems to help us conduct business and maintain, securing it and making sure that systems remain online are two of the most critical things. And knowing all the little things that are in the environment that could potentially take you offline is, I think a lot of companies don't fully understand or appreciate their level of risk exposure, their third-party partnerships.
I think that's a good segue into our next topic, which, Joe, you're an expert in, is CMMC. So how organizations, I mean, NIST has several frameworks. They have an RMF framework, which 80171, which we're going to talk about today, is built off of. So it's all about organizations' risks. And even the newest revision has supply chain. So can you kind of talk to us about what is CMMC and where does it kind of come from? Just the history around that.
Sure. So CMMC stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification. And it's the DoD's attempt to try to secure the different suppliers that supply to the defense industrial base. So numbers vary widely. I've heard figures of 60, 80,000. They believe companies that support the DIB, but that usually only accounts for tier one, maybe tier two suppliers. But this thing runs pretty deep. So some estimates are well over, several 100,000 different companies that support different aspects of the DIB. So
And when you say DIB,
the defense industrial base.
Contractor or vendor that wants to do business with Department of Defense at a certain level, or if they meet certain criteria, whether it be sensitive information, classified, or other things, will be required to meet this certification in order to be approved as a vendor company.
Yeah, that's right. So what's happening is you're seeing that program actually being formed, and it's taken a long time. Nothing happens quickly in the government. I think it goes back to 2009, 2010, roughly, that they've been trying to roll this thing out. There have been challenges with the rollout, but as it stands right now, we're waiting for a final rule to come down from the government, which will solidify what CMMC is. So what's interesting about CMMC is that it's a 3-tiered system. So depending upon what type of work that you're doing for the government, you'll fall between one of the 3 layers. Most of the small manufacturers that we're working with will either be like a level 1 or a level 2. So it's kind of interesting to see. So Nathaniel brought up CMMC utilizes a framework, NIST 800-171. There's 110 controls, well over 300 qualifying statements. And you have to meet every single one of those in order to get credit for meeting the control or the practices, they like to call it. So for level 1, it's 17 controls. For level 2, it's 110. And then 3 is a whole nother thing. And that's usually your bigger primes, like your Lockheed Martins and things like that. So it's a tiered system, like I said. And for every control that you meet, you get points. There's a points value that's associated with each and every one of the practices, which then derives a SPUR score. So basically what we'll do is we can help that client do a gap assessment. We determine if they've either met or not met, and there's a score that comes out of that. They report that score up to either their primes or to the DoD. And that gives them an understanding of, hey, if we're making combat boots, this score is acceptable. If we're doing missile systems, they need to be, maybe a higher system, if that makes sense.
And I think where it speaks to too is really controlling the supply chain, because Department of Defense saw that their nation state secrets were ending up in overseas countries. And in fact, they were often being stolen through means of a supply chain person that was farther down the supply chain. So this is really the Department of Defense's response, right, Joe, to that, try to stop the bleeding here.
Yeah, I would add just to Nathaniel's point is I have a slide deck that I use when I present to clients or potential clients. And one of them is a slide of all the technology that was kind of stolen. And if you look at the next gen fighter, China, their stealth fighter, that whole cockpit was stolen. It's the same exact one that we use on our Raptors. So they're lifting this technology, and it's in their best interest because they don't have to spend all this R&D money, right? They can go get the information. All they need to do is make it, and they're very proficient in building technology items, right? So the other thing I would add to that is it's not only about maybe protecting the secrets, but it's also about keeping disruptions for the supply chain from happening. So think about, we go into a war, we need to make sure that we have adequate capabilities to be able to supply. If these companies are vulnerable, they may be taken offline and then they can't supply, which then creates a real problem. So it's sorely needed, and it needed to happen yesterday, but we're getting there, right? So we're turning around a cruise ship. So we are seeing companies really taking this seriously and starting to move forward, because for a long time, they didn't think it was going to happen.
Really, any company that does business with the government should have had this in place. I think since 2017, it was a requirement. CMMC is a result that companies were saying, "Oh, we have this in place."
Yeah.
But CMMC, the reason that it was actually connected was the government started to see that actually companies would say they didn't actually put these processes in place. So it's a way to certify a certification that a company has to go through an audit and at least in level 2 and level 3 to actually show, hey, we're doing what we say, we're meeting these 110 requirements.
Because we know what happens when we self-attest.
Yeah. So on that note, for CMMC or for that matter, Joe, any new compliance framework that you're challenged with as a IT or cybersecurity practitioner, that challenge lands in your lap. You need to start implementing some sort of compliance framework. How do you start? How do you go about kicking that off and getting prepared to meet those requirements?
Well, you have to start with a gap assessment. You need to know where you are, and it needs to be an honest evaluation. So we recommend that clients reach out to a CMMC certified person. There's folks that are registered practitioners who have gone through the training and kind of understand this stuff. So I would say we start there so that we understand where the gaps are. Then it's working through remediation. Oftentimes they're working client through level 1 first, then we go into level 2. It makes it a little easier to chunk that out, but kind of a crawl, walk, run situation, right?
And in that circumstance, you end up doing an assessment, not gap assessment or some follow-up assessment multiple times before you really say, okay, I'm ready to have an assessor, someone come in and attest to the fact my environment is compliant.
It
Correct.
takes about 12 to 28 months on average, depending upon a number of factors, the scope, complexity, budget, people's time, things like that. Most small organizations, it takes some time. If you haven't been working on this, you're already way behind. You need to start immediately because there's just a lot of things that need to be done. And most of it involves, you got the technical pieces. You can hire that, you can outsource that and bring that in pretty quickly. But it's the policies and the procedures, the plans, the baselines, all of that stuff that has to be done to show we're talking about a maturity model, right? So you can't really do that if you don't have it written somewhere. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges is getting them to sit down and just put everything that's in their head down on paper. And how do you want to go about securing your environment?
It's one thing to have the technical configuration in place, but then to write it down and to keep that updated and to ensure your users are trained on it and have the required policies, that's a very big challenge. How do you see organizations, Joe, doing that policy piece? Do they assign one person to it, or is it kind of a team process?
That's an excellent question. So, I've done enough of these projects now to know kind of where there's going to be some successes. So one thing is if they just put this in IT's lap, it's usually not going to work, right? Because IT doesn't have control of the organization. They don't have the power to influence major decisions within the organization. So usually it's getting someone from one of the business leaders and somebody that's in operations. That's usually the thing. And then, we've built out templates. We've done enough of these to where we've kind of built a systematic approach and we just walk them through it. Are they perfect? No. But are they something to get you started? Absolutely. And then in future reassessments, either they're doing those reassessments internally on their own, or they bring somebody else in, they're going through and they're just reviewing the language. Did it change? Do we need to remove things?
What role would you say
Go ahead.
that business involvement or sponsorship, what role does that play in the overall process? Can you be successful? And I think that what I'm getting at, and not for it to be a lead question, I think I know what the answer is, but it's hard to accomplish any big task in CMMC or compliance, PCI and DSS, SOC 2, you name it, ISO. all these compliance objectives are big deals, and there's a lot that goes into it. Is it possible to achieve that, with just without the business sponsoring it and being actively involved?
My opinion, no, but because I've seen it far too many times where you just have one person that's just tagged to do it. And if they don't have somebody in leadership to help sponsor it and keep it moving, it just dies on the vine.
I've seen that a lot and heard a lot of organizations, and these questions come up in your CISSP certification, the CISM certification test, etc. If you don't have executive sponsorship, somebody up there that's really like from all business units, it can't just be the CEO because it only takes one bad apple kind of spoil the rest. If you don't have that sponsorship and buy-in and the organizational leaders really helping, it just creates too many challenges. And you see that it's much more difficult in a larger organization. A smaller organization, I think that hopefully you're a little bit more closely associated. You're talking to one another. There's collaboration that's happening across different silos and tech vectors and such pretty regularly that enables overcoming some of that. But what you find is cybersecurity in and of itself is a good example. If you just look at things from a cybersecurity perspective, you're not really going to improve your overall security posture. It's really risk. Cybersecurity is fundamentally it's risk. What are we doing that's putting us in a bad spot? How do we correct it?
There's a lot of this stuff where IT's doing, they have maybe the right mindset, but the organization leaders are completely detached. They're inadvertently inheriting all this risk or potential risk that they just don't know about.
Yeah, a lot of times they don't understand what risk they're accepting. You can't
So-
mitigate it. Yes, you don't understand.
This really starts, and I've had a number of really good projects where leadership was like, oh, I get it now. I understand why we're doing all of these different things. Because IT's working in a closet, right? They're in their IT room and they're just trying to keep the lights on. And they're doing a lot of really good, but they can't necessarily explain or articulate it sometimes.
When you think about all these different things that really are starting to bubble up in that ecosystem for technology, governance, compliance, and regulation, privacy now is hitting so many different areas. Cybersecurity is part of that. Really wonder, I think there are probably some organizations, but all of these things are fundamental components of risk. Risk is really the big thing. Why do we have compliance? Well, it's to help mitigate risk. Why do we have cybersecurity? To control risk, protect ourselves, protect our data. What's the privacy about? Well, we don't want to risk, abandoning our customers or partners or, getting their information out there.
I
think part of that is being able to communicate that to your business leaders because they may not understand the technical part. And if you get in the details, we need this multi-factor authentication, we need this tool, that's not going to be a good place to go. But if you can explain, we don't do this. This is actually going to enable us to get this business. If we are compliant, that can be often a more powerful way of communicating. I think I've heard from others too, if you communicate a cybersecurity as a restriction and say, we're going to roll out this new policy and it's going to apply, everybody is not going to buy in. And there's not going to be any buy-in into your policy. But if you roll it out and communicate it effectively, this is going to protect your organization, whatever that may be. And this is how it's going to do it. And here's how we're going to help you out in that. It's much more palatable to the user. And it also allows you still to be compliant and protect and lower your risk too. So I think that's really vital with any compliance framework.
Well, I would say if it's not CMMC that you're having to adhere to, right, there's going to be some other compliance. I think compliance, and you guys correct me, but I feel like compliance is what's the future. I mean, if it's not CMMC, it's going to be cyber insurance. I remember the days where it was 5 questions. Now it's 5 sheets of paper that you got to answer. You know, things like in the state of Ohio where I live, there's Ohio Safe Harbor provisions where if you adopt an accepted framework and if it goes to litigation or something like that, you might have an argument to say, hey, look, we're showing due care and due diligence to make sure that we're doing all the right things. So I feel like, and then we see big manufacturers requiring the small ones to step it up because that's an entryway in. So again, it goes back to supply chain. So they're sending questionnaires over too. So I think it's going to be great because it's going to push us to become a more secure society. You know, compliance doesn't always mean security, but I think it helps in getting you to think through all the important aspects of security.
And I think holistic too, right, Joe? It's not just like, okay, we multi-factor authentication. Framework helps you set the groundwork. We're doing identity. We're also doing personnel management. If you have one, you don't have the other, they're not really useful. But together, they make a full secure ecosystem.
Absolutely.
I had a question about was you're talking about manufacturers and helping these small manufacturers. What about like a manufacturer? Is it a stressful challenge to be compliant or even secure?
It's just lack of resources, money, people, time. You know, their margins are pretty thin. So it's pretty difficult for them, you know, depending upon the contracts from the DoD, unless they're doing some sort of niche manufacturing where they can, you know, basically name their price. Most of these others, it's just super competitive. So they just don't have a lot of money. So that's where, you know, there needs to be some sort of help to get them, you know, where they need. And that's where sometimes we're able to help them with their compliance through a number of different channels through, you know, if we have it available grants, we also have the ways that we can do things for a less cost hourly rate. So trying to find some ways to harness what resources you have. If you can't do it internally, try to reach out and look for partnerships that can help you. But I would say that it's resources is the biggest problem.
And there's some pretty cool resources actually for free, right? With the DID that, especially depending on what state you are in too, sometimes there's even more.
Yes. So there are free tools. And then I even recommend a lot of open source tools too, but sometimes that's a challenge as well because, you know, open source requires you to have a little bit more know-how to get the stuff implemented that they may not have in-house.
Really appreciate, Jerry, your expertise. I think it's been helpful. I definitely go, you know, a lot of times getting started is the hardest part. Finding a way to start, but that means a partnership with an organization, or sometimes it's just as simple as assigning someone and saying, hey, here's what it is, figure it out. Going to entrust you to get started. And that ultimately is probably going to lead to, hey, we need help here. We need more resources. We need a partner. Getting started is often the most difficult.
It's just trying to eat the elephant one bite at a time.
And, you know, sometimes these standards can be innocuous to read and not very clear unless you like inundate yourself with like information about the standard that really make sure you are at least can understand the language they use. Like NIST has a certain way of saying certain things. And I think reading their document a bunch of times, I remember when I was getting kind of into this, it was really helpful to do it like 6 or 7 times a month at least. Read all the standards, even like the appendix and the different documents, and listen to all the current webinars. And that really helps you be able to be more comfortable with it so that you can at least start to understand what's going on here.
Yeah, I would say coming from IT, that was the biggest challenge is understanding because the words mean something.
Yes.
And it really wasn't until I took my CISSP that I really appreciated how language and the words that they choose to use and what that really means. Because in previous experiences, I would get some sort of requirement and I'm like, we're doing that. But I didn't understand by organizationally defined, that meant it's written down somewhere, right? And it's been approved and people all agree with it. So to your point, it's absolutely right. I mean, the language is kind of murky. So that's where I think if you just ask for some help, there's a lot of people out there that probably answer one or two questions from you if you have questions. So, I always make myself available. So always around to try to help them understand what it is.
All right. Joe, any final thoughts you want to share?
Thank you guys. I've really enjoyed this
I
and
appreciate you joining us. Been
absolutely
great conversation. There'll be opportunities for follow-up. Hopefully we can have you back at some point.
I would love to.
Well, appreciate the time from you, Joe, and thanks everyone for listening. Stay secure and safe. We will talk again soon.